Hello, and welcome to our final version of our domestic violence series, where we're emphasizing paying particular attention to female perpetrators and male victims. Now, for the previous three, we identified we defined domestic violence. We talked about models of intervention in relation to the traditional approach. We looked at research that sort of challenged the assumption that the males were more often than not the perpetrators relative to primary aggressors and or initiators. We sort of explored the concept of the battered male or husband syndrome, recognizing that it's not as much of a joke as we often make it out to be. We also began to look at the female perpetrator and began to realize that, yeah, it's real. It's more dominant than we think. We looked at some of the reasons why the female perpetrates. And I want to end our presentation just dedicating this particular area to female perpetrators only. We're just going to look at female perpetrators, going to share about the personalities, a couple of scenarios, and maybe play a little game. Who am I? When we talk about domestic violence, usually we're talking about the perpetrator being contained and the victim being protected. And relative to police reports, we know that 85% of the perpetrators are male and about 15% are female. That's relative to police reports. That's relative to domestic violence. But we also know that there is domestic abuse, which might have the same characteristics relative to behavior as violence, but it's not adjudicated. The criminal component is not there because they haven't gone to court. The police haven't been called. It's a private family affair. So when we look at the issues of domestic violence in relation to a universality of victim and perpetrator between males and females, we realize that the level field is pretty standard in relation to, or pretty uniform in relation to females and males. One of the most convincing areas, or some of the most convincing research was found relative to the bilateral, which is what, tit for tat, representing about 50% of the self-reported intimate partner violence. And then 25% being what? Initiated and dominated by men, and 25% being initiated and dominated by women. If that is the case, then we have reason to pay attention to the more than concept of the female perpetrator. What I've learned in the research is that there are 4 basic categories of female perpetrator, and that when the female is questioned or shared, and this is in relation to the traditional adjudicated domestic violence perpetrator getting intervention, there are 4 different categories. Now please know this. This is just relative to the ones that were reported by the police, got arrested, went to court, were found guilty of domestic violence, and receiving treatment. There are 4 different types of perpetrator. Now, I'm sharing this to just begin to add some more insight into the world of the female perpetrator. Some people believe that in relation to the primary aggressor, that actually the females and the males, 25% each. In relation to the issues associated with court-ordered cases, about 25% of the 15% of female perpetrators are traditional. And when we say traditional, they basically resemble the male in their attitudes towards their partners. Narcissistic. A person who's narcissistic, impressed with themselves, expecting to have their own way, delusions of grandeur, not very pleasant to be around. That is one of the traits for a classic perpetrator, which comprises only about 25% of the adjudicated female domestic violence perpetrators. Full of denial, not willing to admit or own the reality of their behavior, tending to what? Blame the victim, something that our communities go out of their way to do. But a traditional perpetrator blames the victim. You might hear something like, and I'm using the perspective of a female, he knows how I am. He should know not to make me mad. He knows how I get when he makes me mad. These are the words of a classic perpetrator. Full of denial, blaming the victim. Very resistive to intervention, very, very resistive. Perhaps they're the person joking in the room. They're the person finding excuses for the behavior, identifying perhaps racism, classism, sexism, all kinds of issues to what? Justify the behavior. Just resistive to intervention. There's this concept of antisocial personality disorder. This is also a characteristic of a traditional perpetrator, including 25% of the women who are adjudicated as perpetrators of domestic violence. Antisocial personality disorder would be represented by a person who seems very charming, very manipulative, with a flat affect when it comes to hurting other people, lacking a conscience and showing no visible remorse. Whenever we talk about this syndrome, Jeffrey Dahmer is the one that comes to mind. People always bring him up because what? He didn't seem remorseful. He didn't seem repentant. And that bothers us in relation to the amount of harm that he inflicted in relation to his victims and the number of victims that he attacked. So the antisocial personality disorder is probably one of the most challenging in relation to an intervention. The classic perpetrator is very directive, very, very directive. Please know that you have two different styles of intervention. One is directive and one is influential. Directive is usually seen as masculine. I'll call it Martian because indeed these female perpetrators are acting as if they were from Mars, directive. Now, the underside or the dysfunctional side of a directive approach to communicating, negotiating, to leadership would be abuse. You see, either I tell you what to do, and if I can't negotiate it by telling you what to do, then I'm going to force you to do what I want you to do. So we have this sort of dysfunctional directive approach found in a classic female perpetrator. You also have the issue, again, of victim blaming, directly blaming the victim. It's so much easier. He or she should not have provoked me. It's their fault. They know how I get. Then you have issues of delusion, usually delusions of grandeur. They perceive things that simply do not exist. They see themselves uniquely. Nobody else sees what they see. And that could be an issue. And too often, what? They're unsuccessfully trying to present themselves as the victim, especially in the female population. Why? Because it's highly probable that they would be seen as the victim. Well, that's the personality, the character traits it represents the character traits of a classic perpetrator. And know that in relation to female perpetrators, 25% are captured in this area. Now, in relation to the other 75%, now this is only relative to cases of domestic violence. In the other 75% of the cases of female perpetrators, you have different, what am I going to call it, different derivatives of victims. You have the bilateral violator, the vengeful violator, and the true victim violator. And I'm going to go in order of approaching, victimization. The bilateral violator is seen as the most common form of intimate partner violence, period. And in some studies, it was seen as making up 50% of intimate partner violence. Why would I say intimate partner violence? Because it helps us to differentiate between domestic violence and domestic abuse. When we talk about intimate partner violence, we're capturing the ones that got caught by the police, adjudicated by the courts, as well as those who haven't gotten caught yet, but they're indulging in it. And when you include everybody in the sample, the statistics show that bilateral or intimate partner violence is captured by bilateral violence more than anything else. And this is that tit for tat. My mother taught me that if you hit me, you're going to get hit back. My mother taught me that if I hit you, I can expect to get hit back. It's tit for tat. Learned behavior. Very much learned behavior. It's social learning theory at its best, but that's the case for all of these issues. It's, the perception I can hold my own. I got this. I can handle myself. I'm time enough for him. I'm not going to let him hit me and I not hit him back. Bilateral aggression. And usually the independent person, the person who perceives themselves, and this is in relation to female perpetrators, as strong. Let me just share with you relative to that syndrome. I'm going to call it the strong woman syndrome. You have a situation where perhaps the female has, gone through some changes with male relationships, and she hasn't decided to enter into a lesbian relationship. She's just kind of sworn off men, forever. And men approach her, and she simply isn't interested. She turns them off, maybe unwittingly, perhaps unknowingly. But she can't understand why no one is drawn to her. Well, most guys, especially those who are not perpetrators, realize that no means no. And when they get the turn-off signal by perhaps this strong personality, they know go find somebody else. Now, how would a woman like that wind up in a domestically abusive, violent situation? Well, one thing about a perpetrator, a classic perpetrator, that I might not have mentioned is the fact that they don't know boundaries. They have no boundaries. They don't know that no means no. They keep coming until they get their way. Now, just imagine this strong woman who has had her way by discouraging male advances. And most men, normal men, no means no. So they take it for what it is. They leave her alone. But now you have this perpetrator. He doesn't have any boundaries. So her no just means I really want you to pay attention to me. And he does. He perseveres. And eventually he gets through. And they establish a relationship. And in her mind, he's the only one who loves her, which is playing right into a perpetrator's hands. Because one of the things they like to do is to sort of seclude their victims. He's the only one who loves me. He's the only one who cares, etc., etc., etc. Perhaps she didn't have a healthy relationship with her dad, her brothers, etc. So now, here she is in a relationship with a perpetrator that she sees as the only one who loves her. Now, things are going well, but then, he starts being aggressive, and so does she. She wasn't raised not to be. She probably had some trauma in relation to having to be. And here we have perhaps a scenario that would explain to a greater than lesser degree the issue of the bilateral violator, the strongest incidence of intimate partner violence. So what happens? He breaks in relation to her armor, they form a relationship, they create a union, and now the battling begins. Bilateral violence in relation to the female perpetrator. A third category of perpetrator is what I call her the vengeful violator. This is the one that's strongly and demonstrably passive-aggressive. The burning bed is an example of what I would call the vengeful violator. And the case in relation to the male victim who was found not guilty of the crime of defending himself relative to his perpetrating wife, vengeful violator. They kind of picked their times. And it looks like it was premeditated, but when you explore the patterned behavior relative to them being victimized in the past in relation to the perpetrator, one can understand that, yeah, this person is probably more victim than perpetrator. It's just that their defense was planned and strategized. Their defense seemed like it was premeditated. However, it was in response to systemic abuse and violence, and they truly did feel defenseless to the point where they could not fight back until the perpetrator was vulnerable, maybe sleeping. So we have an example. Now, the metaphor that I like to use is, I think it was in Medea's, one of the Medea series, Family Reunion, where she shares an example of what? The vengeful violator. She says what? Wait till it gets good and comfortable, and then you attack, you see. That's what's going on in relation to the vengeful violator. Now, perhaps the word vengeful is a bit strong, but it certainly does convey the reality that one waits and picks their times in relation to retaliating, and for that reason, it is often seen as premeditated, and too often the victim, this kind of victim, is found guilty as the perpetrator. When we think about the vengeful violator, it is often an issue of perhaps temporary insanity or just an attempt to protect themselves. But it is premeditated, it's planned, and it usually occurs when the person who had been traditionally the perpetrator is not expecting it. Unlike the final category found in the victim violator. And this person is suffering from something that happened that was purely accidental. It was truly self-defense. They were simply trying to get away, trying to run away, and in a desperate act, perhaps inflicted, in this particular case, more harm than the perpetrator or the person who was traditionally the perpetrator. Usually, they also suffer historically from being abused by the perpetrator. They'll be the first to admit, and often to their demise, it was all my fault. That's a problem. They're traumatized, and oftentimes they have attachment issues. They are probably closer to a traditional victim than any of the other three. And it is because they are the prototype of the traditional victim. It's just that in their attempt to get away this time, the perpetrator got hurt very badly, such that when the police arrived, this time they were seen as the primary aggressor instead of the perpetrator. So you have 4 different categories. You have the classic perpetrator in relation to female perpetrators. You have the bilateral perpetrator. You have the vengeful perpetrator. And then you have the victim perpetrator. All of them adjudicated as guilty of domestic violence. Now, what I want you to do with me is to play a game, and I'm going to invite you to sort of share your responses in relation to maybe recognizing some of these standard roles. I'm going to go into role, and then I'm going to invite you to share who I am. We have person A, B, C, and of course D. And of course they are the 4 types of perpetrators. Here's the first role. It's not fair. I mean, I don't know why I went to jail. He knows how angry I get. I don't know why he purposely provokes me the way that he does with his stupid comments. He should have learned by now that I just don't deal that way. He can't do anything right. I don't know why I'm with him anyway. He knows how I am. He should be the one in jail, not me. He made me mad enough to do what I do. Who am I? That's person A. Who is person A? Then we have person B. Oh my God, this can't be happening. Is he okay? I need to see him. I need to tell him I'm sorry. Yes, I shot him. I know I shouldn't have. Oh, I'm sorry. He came at me just like he always does. But this time I knew, or I believed anyway, that if I didn't do anything, he was going to kill me. Who am I? That's person B. Here we have person C. Yeah, I hit him, and I'll hit him again. My family taught me that if you hit somebody, you can expect to get hit back. That's how we roll here. Maybe I did start it this time, but what about all those times that he passed the first lick? What about those, huh? No, you don't have anything to say about those. Now you come to arrest me when I just happened to win this fight. Who am I? That's person C. Finally, we have person D. Yes, I did it, and I'm sorry. He's been abusing me in front of my children for years. And I just couldn't take it anymore. I just couldn't take the looks on my daughter's faces when he hit me. I just couldn't take it anymore. They look at me saying, Mom, why do you let him slap you? They look at me and saying, Mom, how come we're still here? They look at me and saying, Mom, why? Why do you take it? So I finally did something about it. Who am I? That's person D. Now, when we talk about the first one, person A, I'm trusting. Perhaps I should give you a minute to write your answers down. A, B, C, and D. When we're talking about person A, I'm trusting that you realize that this person is blaming the victim. This person is holding the victim responsible. This person is really not taking responsibility for their actions. So who are they? And I hope I'm doing this right. They're the classic perpetrator. The classic perpetrator. Blaming the victim and not taking responsibility. Now, person B represents the victim perpetrator. All they were doing was trying to get away. They did not intend to hurt that person. Then you have person C, the bilateral perpetrator. You hit me, I'm going to hit you back. You hit me, I'm going to hit you back. That's the way we roll in here. And finally, we have the vengeful perpetrator. And this is the one who picked their time after having suffered perpetual abuse. The vengeful perpetrator. Let me just go over these things once more. The vengeful perpetrator is the one who suffered abuse over and over and over again and finally decided to do something about it, but they weren't empowered enough to do it until the perpetrator was sort of disabled, perhaps sleeping. The bilateral perpetrator is the one who decided, and they were raised what? He hits me, I'm going to hit him back. The victim perpetrator is the one who just accidentally became the primary aggressor, trying to get away from the perpetrator. And the classic perpetrator is the one who blames the victim, is narcissistic, and actually holds all of the tendencies of a male perpetrator. There are many, many resources that are available for battered men. You have Washington's Domestic Violence Hotline. You have the national and international resources for battered men. You have the Domestic Abuse Hotline. You also have the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention. You also have a whole slew, and if you just Google, for lack of a better way to put you in touch with resources, battered males, a whole plethora, a whole cadre of resources will come up. When she was bad, she was bad. Wonderful research on female perpetrators. I want to thank you for the time that you have shared with us in relation to this video series. I want to encourage you to stay sensitive to the issues of domestic violence. I want you to realize that victims come in all shapes, sizes, and genders, as do perpetrators. And while official cases of domestic violence indicate that males dominate, when you really get in the privacy of the home, males and females probably fare equally in relation to the role of victim and the role of perpetrator. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us as we look forward to hearing from you, but more than anything, recognizing the need for intervention.